because most famous theologians and serious biblical scholars, there's nobody at Yale who thinks that the New Testament is without contradiction.
Oh yeah, these were people coming to talk about basically, about God but I was surprised when when confronted with as inevitably, I think anyone is, the apparent not just internal contradictions between the scriptures as different writers write, as you talk about at length in both books and in general, but the contradictions with science. But that's what I found amazing, is that they could take these contradictions and turn them around and do this immense set of logical steps from one to the other till they came back and it was all, apparently made it seem consistent when it wasn't at all. I was impressed by their fluidity of that regard, but I'm more impressed by people who look at contradictions and say they're contradictions, I think.
Right. Well, that's a trick. One reason it's a tricky business is because I think a lot of people who are sophisticated, who are theologians, think of theological reasoning in a different sphere from scientific reasoning, and they see that as different from mathematical reasoning, and they see that as different from sociological reasoning, and they think that these different spheres have different ways of justifying knowledge and grounding knowledge, and so they don't think not all. There's not like a view about this. There are millions of views about it. But one view is that it means that you can't really use science to discredit claims that aren't susceptible to science. And so when somebody like when someone like Sam Harris or somebody says that, that it's a contradiction of science, that to be religious, you have to disbelieve science. These people just roll their eyes and say, no, actually it doesn't work that way, because scientific knowledge, it's not that they really believe there's an Adam and Eve or anything like that.
But although some,
but they think that God talk somehow isn't kind of confined within the ways of science.
That's interesting. I wasn't. You just reminded me of something I wasn't going to bring up, but I've had chances over the years, including at the Vatican, but to speak to many theologians, because I used to get invited to lots of different places, and I always ask the theologian one question, because in my opinion, theology itself is not an area of scholarship, of what I would call academic scholarship in the sense. And I confronted them by asking the following question. I'd say, give me one example in the last 500 years of a contribution to knowledge that theology has provided. Now, I'm not talking about a history or philosophy, and I always got the same answer, which I guess the way you talk about it makes it clear. Every single time the answer was, what do you mean by knowledge? And I thought that was fascinating. I didn't quite, it really shocked me at the time, but in the context of what you're saying, it makes it clear. Like and I would always say, well, if I asked a chemist or a biologist or a historian, they'd tell me right off. They wouldn't ask that question, what do you mean by knowledge? And I think in some sense they have to, right? Because you have to assume somehow, in order to account for all this, you have to assume that there's some distinction between knowledge in the rest of the world and knowledge of God.
Well, theologians do think that they've made progress on certain issues, but since nothing is testable, it's not knowledge in the same sense. I mean, you can't. How do you show that a particular theological view is right or wrong? And it doesn't work in the same way that you can do some have an experiment or something.
Well, in philosophy you can, but I guess that's what I'm saying. I mean, it seems to me what I used to argue. I don't want to be too controversial here or contradictory here, but I used to say, well, you could take theology and you could take the parts where they're useful. There's history, there's literary criticism, there's philosophy, there's logic. Put them in their relative departments, and then there's nothing left.
Look, I'm on your side on this, but they would say that it's different because it has a different subject and it has a different grounding, and I know people who are not in that world just think, man, that's, I don't know, they've stuck their head in the ground. But as you've experienced, there's some very smart people doing this.
Remarkably smart and remarkably literate, and it's really fascinating to me. And I want to, we'll get to that in the context of your writing later, because Well, anyway, we'll get to it. I want to go in a circle. I want to start with you and I want to end with you. But if we, in 6 or 8 hours from now, no, hopefully not.
Okay.
But,
It's all about me.
yeah, that's right. Well, and you're the interesting person that I wanted to talk to, and I've learned a lot just both listening to you and reading you, and I appreciate it. But the one just as you talked about the road to belief, that well, it was pretty quick there. It was a born again moment. You want to talk about the road to disbelief? I mean, you started to get liberal, but and the contradictions, was it just the fact that there were contradictions that were inherently there that led you to disbelief, or was it more?
Actually, it wasn't that at all, as it turns out. The contradictions opened my eyes to the Bible being a very human book.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was probably my third year in my master's program. I started realizing that I just couldn't hold on to a strong evangelical understanding of the Bible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I remained a Christian for a long time. I did my PhD. I was a Christian the whole time I was a PhD. During my PhD, I was a minister of a Baptist church, preached on the radio every Sunday morning, and did funerals and weddings and things.
Wow.
Yeah, a Baptist church. So I stayed a Christian, and then I became increasingly liberal, I'd say. I got to a point where I was a very, very liberal Christian, where I believed, I thought there was some kind of divine being in the universe, and that Jesus was the way that this divine being could be better understood. The stories about Jesus, I didn't think that we literally knew everything Jesus said or did or anything like that. But I thought that the kind of the biblical story embraced, in some sense, the kind of the ultimate meaning of the universe that's backed by some kind of divine being out there. Is a very liberal view. But at some point, probably about 30 years ago, I just gave it all up. And it wasn't because of any of my scholarship per se, my biblical scholarship. It really was because of trying to wrestle with the problem of suffering. And, whatever one thinks as a Christian, I mean, the basic line is that there's a divine being in the world who intervenes and helps people when they are in need and saves people. And I thought about it for a long time, read about it for a long time in various fields, philosophy, theology, biblical study. I got to a point where I just didn't believe there's a God who's active in the world. You just look around. Just look around.
So clear to me and so obvious, but
there's so much pain and suffering among people who have there's nothing redemptive about it. Sometimes there's nothing salvific about it. There's nothing good about it. And, saying that it's all going to be made right later didn't do much for me. And somebody has to be tortured now so that they can have a nice afterlife. It just didn't make any sense to me. So I finally gave it up. It was after I came to Chapel Hill. I had been teaching here for a few years.
You were active
Yeah, I went to the local Episcopal church and taught adult Sunday school for some years. And
so while you were at Rutgers before, then you were still...
at Rutgers, I was still active as a Christian in a church.
Right.
And so it's
that's
kind of
fascinating.
strange.
Moving to North Carolina to become away from New Jersey to North Carolina to become to lose your faith is kind of the opposite of most people.
Right. Yeah, I know. Who would have thought? But yeah, I know. But I just got to a point where I couldn't accept it anymore, and so left it.
Now you call yourself agnostic, or at least written you're agnostic. But I wrote the foreword for a book called The Case for Atheism. And I had to read the book. It's an old book, so you may know the book. But I figured if I was going to write the foreword, I should read the book. And it was the first time he said something that is obvious to me in retrospect, and yet most people it didn't hit me then, and most people don't buy it. Which is, agnostics are atheists, in the sense that atheists don't have to be. Atheists aren't people. There's some atheists who say everything is wrong. There's no God. I know it. I'm certain. Blah blah blah. But all that atheism is in principle saying is the stories don't convince me. I'm not convinced by anything I've read. And that's a whole spectrum, including agnostics who say, well, I'm not convinced by anything I've read, but that doesn't mean, there's something I don't know about. Do you buy that? Do you agree with that or no?
So I have a different view of what atheism and agnosticism are than most people have.
Okay.
When I left the faith, I had the kind of view you're talking about, which is that the atheism and agnosticism are kind of on a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
and that agnostics are ones who say, "Well, I don't really know," and atheists, like a hardcore atheist, says, "There is no God." And
Yeah.
and with that, when I became an agnostic, I had no idea going into it that if you do polarize these two groups and have a binary of agnostics and atheists, they really are antagonistic toward one another.
Yeah.
I just thought they'd all be kind of the same,
Yeah.
but the way it worked out is that atheists all in this binary, the atheists all thought that the agnostics were simply wimpy atheists.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't believe in God, but they're afraid to say it.
Yeah.
And the agnostics, on the other hand, thought that the atheists were just arrogant agnostics. Like, they don't know. How the hell would they know? But
Like
they're saying
dogmatic agnostics in a sense.
dogmatic.
Yeah.
But now I call myself both an agnostic and an atheist.
Me too.
Because I think that they're talking about two different things. Agnosticism literally means don't know from the Greek. I don't know. So if somebody asks me, is there a superior divine being in the universe? I don't know. How would I know?
Yeah.
But if somebody asks me, do you believe there is? I'd say, no, I don't think it is. I don't believe it is.
Yeah.
And so I think agnosticism has to do with knowledge and atheism has to do with belief. But it ends up kind of where you are too. It means that really, I think both are both.
Yeah, both are both. It's, if we just said atheism instead of atheism, it would be a little bit better, because it's sort of basically saying, I don't.
Mhm.
It's not. I don't think of it as belief, but rather a lack of belief. Or
Yeah.
I try to actually, as a scientist, I make it quite clear, because I'm asked all the time, "Do you believe in this and that?" And I try, although I don't. I'm not perfect in this regard, in any regard. I try to never use the word belief, because I say things are either likely or they're not likely. But from this, if I'm got my scientist hat on, the belief, there's no room for belief in science. It's
yeah. Well, that you probably know. I mean, you would know better than me. That goes back to ancient Greek philosophical traditions.
Yeah.
Belief is kind of a second category of knowledge, and so that I would agree with that. But that's why I think they're two different belief, and I wouldn't say it's actually just a weaker form of knowledge. I'd say, in fact, it's a different category, belief and knowledge. And
well, I mean. Yeah. I guess, well, we're going place I hadn't planned to, but this is good. I'll try and get to your books as well in detail, but I hope you don't mind having a general conversation as well.
No,
because I'm fascinated by it, to talk to someone who's thought about these things in such detail. But see, for me, I'm an old-fashioned kind of scientist, and for me, there is no knowledge but empirical knowledge. There's nothing that there may be wisdom from reflection, but no knowledge has ever been gained by revelation. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm a complete empiricist too. I mean, I'm a complete materialist.
Well, and you can see the empiricism in your analysis. If you want to say, you're going to say, well, what could this gospel person have thought? Let's look, and did this come from their writing? Let's see what evidence we have. And I did find it fascinating. I have to say, I found it overwhelming in some ways. Your energy to be able to explore the details of the scriptures is something it's by nature. I would never be able to devote that kind of energy to it. It's just because to me it just all seems clearly. I don't want to say nonsense, but it seems clearly myth and belief, and I guess therefore I tend to just sort of automatically by disposition sort of discount it.
No, I get that. I mean, it's like spending your life trying to, analyze the truth behind a grim fairy tale or something. Well, what's the point? I mean, it's a fairy tale. But in my case, I got so interested in it as a Christian, that interest continued because I realized there's a lot of historical and cultural importance to this material, and so I'm endlessly fascinated by it, in part because so many people completely misunderstand it. But there are over 2 billion Christians in the world who believe in the Bible. It seems useful to try and figure out what it's really all about.
And it's great. And as my friend, my late friend, the physicist Stephen Weinberg, also an atheist, would say, that in trying to explain that, you're doing God's work, and I would agree with you. But I think it is really important for someone to be able to say honestly, here, let's talk about what's actually here, and someone with someone who isn't already typecast like me, someone who's willing to think about it carefully and who has the appropriate credentials as well, for whatever that's worth. And that's why it's so fascinating to go through this and see in detail why most of what is conventionally believed is wrong. I mean, when I think